In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw a landscape in pen and ink. I'm going to give you some tips on what to look for in a potential subject, talk about how to use the rules of composition to improve upon the subject you've chosen, and then demonstrate the drawing process. Landscape drawing is a huge subject encompassing many different skills, and I'm going to be as comprehensive as I can, but in places where it would take up too much time, I'll direct you to tutorials on my channel which cover the topic in greater depth. Let's begin with that most important of tasks, choosing your subject. What should we be looking for? The first step is to find something interesting to draw, and that, of course, is highly subjective. Some people are drawn to rustic farmhouses or to dramatic mountainscapes. Others are drawn to intricate brutalist architecture or narrow trash-filled alleys. Whatever your interests are, however, it's important to think about what general qualities, what basic qualities to look for that'll make your subject a good choice for a drawing. To answer this question, it's useful to look at some old master landscape drawings and think about what made them great. Let's start with this drawing by Van Gogh. While very many things were done correctly here, at the heart of it, what makes this drawing tick is a very basic, I would say overarching principle of effective visual design. This drawing is composed of strong, contrasting, and overlapping shapes. By strong, I mean that these shapes are clearly visible, making them easy to outline. That means that if you're looking at a subject and you can't easily identify basic shapes, it's possible that what you're seeing is not an effective choice for a drawing. What do I mean by contrasting? I mean that these shapes are different from each other. The difference could be in size or in complexity. A shape could be angular versus a shape that's organic. They can also be different in dimension and orientation. And by overlapping, I mean that these shapes are interlocked, each of them an integral part of a whole, so that it feels like if one shape is taken out, everything else in the composition would collapse. Let's see if we can break this drawing down into those basic shapes and learn something about them. The most basic shapes to consider are these two, the shape of the buildings and the trees against the sky. What an interesting jagged and varied shape that is. There are a bunch of subshapes to consider as well. Notice the variety of shapes here, from jagged and complex, flat and simple, large and small, organic and rectilinear. The character of these shapes plays a large part in giving the drawing an overarching sense of organization, energy, and even sometimes psychology. Smooth, rounded shapes with clean overlaps create a sense of order and serenity. Jagged, crumpled shapes create tension and anxiety. Related shapes can give a sense of rhythm and energy. Regardless of the quality of shape, they should look like they're locked together, inseparable from one another, giving your composition structure and unity. This drawing has a lot going for it, of course, a wonderfully energetic variety of mark making and a rustic and poetic theme, but without those underlying shapes, this drawing would have absolutely no power. Let's do another quick analysis of shapes in this drawing, this time of a loose yet precise sketch by Rembrandt. Again, note the complex shape created by the trees and cottages against the sky. Then we have the subshapes, all of them different in complexity and orientation. The rapid line work and gentle washes, the masking of the shadows and lights, all of them play a part here. But what makes this work striking is the initial attention Rembrandt paid to the bones of the picture. This drawing by Rembrandt's colleague, Jan Levens, is not so strong in this respect. Even though the rendering is handled brilliantly, the overall drawing lacks those strong shapes, and as a result, the drawing can be admired for its lovingly handled details, but as a composition, it's not particularly striking. So, the first rule when searching for a subject is to look for clearly defined, large, varied, and overlapping shapes. What else should we look for? Let's examine a few more old master drawings and see if we can arrive at even more principles. Here's a drawing, well, actually an etching, by Rembrandt. And here's one by a far less well-known Dutch contemporary, Roland Savery. And here's another Van Gogh. One thing all of these drawings have in common is a strong sense of depth. You feel like you can wander through them, feel the air against your skin, and even peek behind the frame to see the world that didn't fit into the picture. How do these three artists create this impression? The obvious answer is the use of linear and atmospheric perspective. The perhaps slightly less obvious answer is that their choice of subject is chosen for its clearly defined separation of foreground, middle ground, and background. In other words, in all three of these drawings, you can easily discern something that's very close to you, something that's further away in the middle ground, and something that's very far away in the background. Choosing subjects with a clearly defined space will allow you to render distance more easily and effectively, giving your drawing a greater sense of depth, making it better. Let's return to this drawing by Van Gogh. Notice how clearly he separates the planes and how this contributes to pulling your eye into the composition, forcing it to wander through it. So, the second rule we've arrived at is to look for a subject with a clear foreground, middle ground, and background. This is something I'm always looking for in my subjects. Here are two references. The first one has a lot going for it, a bunch of strong shapes and dramatic evening light, but there's just not enough happening in the foreground. This second version is stronger, with the inclusion of a bench. Not only does it create an area of focus and additional contrast, that foreground element completes the composition by adding a stronger sense of depth. The third rule in choosing a subject is to look for strong diagonals or curves. To demonstrate the importance of this rule, here are two versions of the same landscape. Here is the first one, where I have a field, and on that field I have a house, a door, a window, and then in front of the house I have a road, and on that road I have a car. And then somewhere in the distance, a tree. In option B, I have exactly the same subject, except now I have a field, and the road zigzags like this. And now the house, as opposed to being straight on, looks like this. And our car looks like this. And our tree, let's place it right here. Looks like this. Whenever I show these two examples to my students and ask them which one is better, almost always the answer is B, but they usually have difficulty explaining why. Usually the answer is, well, B has more movement to it. But why exactly, they can't really explain. The answer is this. A has lots of very long horizontal and vertical lines which give the impression of stability, of immovability, whereas B has lots of very strong diagonals which create a sense of movement. This has something to do with a very primitive instinct that probably was developed in the earliest times of humanity, where if I'm standing underneath some rocks and those rocks are vertical and horizontal, I feel safe. However, if those rocks have some kind of diagonal tilt to them, I'm probably going to hesitate standing underneath. I'll probably use my diagonals and run away, right? So diagonals create an impression of movement, and the more diagonals you include in the composition, the more the eye moves through the space, and generally speaking, since one of the main things a composition needs to do is move the eye, that composition is going to be more effective than one that's composed of, again, long horizontals and verticals. Finding diagonals usually isn't hard. The main thing to avoid are long, monotonous horizontals. And all that requires is changing your viewing angle. When it comes to buildings, I try to place myself in a position where I can see more than one side. In other words, I avoid one-point perspective situations where the tops and bottoms of the buildings are horizontal and gravitate toward situations that are in two-point perspective, where the sides of the building recede toward vanishing points, creating those dynamic diagonals. Here's a photo taken from a one-point perspective situation. Though there are a few diagonals here and there, the many long horizontals make this reference less dynamic and weaker than this one. This photo was taken from a two-point perspective angle, which creates more diagonals that give the composition more movement. A simple rule of thumb is to look for two sides of a building, a left side and a right side. If you can only see the front, chances are you'll get a weaker composition out of it. Let's take a look at a few more drawings by Van Gogh, and note the use of diagonals in almost all of his compositions. The bold frenetic line work and energetic hatching definitely play a part in making this drawing lively, but underpinning all of that movement are the variety of diagonals and curves running through the compositions. One thing to keep in mind is that shadows are as an important part of the subject as anything else, and that a strong cast shadow can create the dynamic diagonals in what might otherwise be a static composition. Cast shadows can also serve as a foreground element, as we see in this photo. The problem with shadows, of course, is that they'll move, so make sure to draw them in early so that they won't disappear on you later. This is something that the old masters often utilized. Here's an example by Claude Lorrain where he threw a diagonal cast shadow into the foreground. This type of compositional trick is very, very common and was probably synthetic in the majority of cases, meaning that Lorrain probably didn't see that shadow in the foreground and just made it up to improve on things. So, to summarize, when looking for a subject, we have 3 rules. First, look for large, varied, and overlapping shapes. Second, look for a clear separation between foreground, middle ground, and background. And third, look for strong diagonals and curves. The last thing I'd like to say on the subject is that finding a subject is no easy task, calling for a tremendous amount of forethought. With experience, an artist learns to anticipate what will make for an interesting motif and will increasingly make correct choices. But even then, there are just too many variables to consider, and all too often you realize, sometimes several hours into a drawing, that you've made a horrible choice and are working on a drawing that'll bring shame and dishonor to yourself, your ancestors, and even your descendants. Learn to live with the shame and move forward to the next drawing. Eventually, you'll find yourself stumbling on better and better subject matter and making better and better decisions. Okay, let's say that I've walked around and found a potentially effective subject. Here it is. Bonus points to anyone who can identify this very famous building. Now it's time to start thinking about the specifics of the composition. The subject itself has already given me a general idea, but there are still some important decisions to be made. Doing a few studies would help with those decisions, since they're best worked out on paper. But let's say I'm short on time, I need to work out the composition as I go. I start sketching things in, and I start thinking about 3 additional compositional rules. Some people recommend using a viewfinder, like this, to help determine the composition. I do not, and once I explain these 3 additional compositional rules, I'll explain why. Here is rule number 1, avoid centering. This means that putting the visually most important thing right in the middle of your composition is usually a bad idea. I'm sure most of you have heard this rule and even use it, but I wonder how many people out there know why centering should be avoided. Earlier I mentioned that an effective composition needs to accomplish 2 things. It needs to move the eye and it needs to unify. There are 2 slightly competing theories at play for why one shouldn't center. One is that centering splits the composition into 2 equal parts, creating 2 distinct visual pathways for the eye to move through, creating disunity. The second is that a centered dominant element draws the eye to the middle of the composition and prevents it from moving. Since the eye doesn't move, there's less visual stimulation and the picture feels more static and less interesting. As with anything in art, there are plenty of successful examples of when that centering rule is broken, but in most cases, that rule is broken for the sake of concept, to evoke a certain mood, or to relate a narrative. A good example of this is religious iconography. Depictions of Jesus, such as this painting by Giovanni Bellini, are often centered because the artist wanted the viewer to be drawn and fixated to the immutable divine figure in the center. Here's another famous example of centering by the German romantic Arnold Böcklin, where you can see the use of centering to create a somber, otherworldly stillness. This is all to say that the rules of composition are not rules at all, but rather strategies used to increase your chances of making a compelling image. Feel free to break them, but if you do, know what results you're aiming to achieve. All right, what is rule number 2? It's to avoid tangents. Here's an example of a tangent. Tangents are alignments of objects at different distances. They should be avoided because they create the impression that those objects are connected, making your image less readable. There's another kind of tangent we have to worry about, and it's a connection between objects and the edge of the picture. This again creates a sense of confusion because it glues the object to the edge of the picture. In a still life, a tangent can be fixed by shifting things a little bit. While it's easy enough to walk up to a still life and move it in any way you want, the same cannot be said of landscape. Instead, you'll have to shift your position until the tangents resolve themselves. But there's another, even easier solution, and it's the reason why I do not recommend using a viewfinder. This method is derived from a fundamental truth. It's not the job of an artist to be a human copy machine. Our goal should be to improve upon nature and not to slavishly copy it. To that end, we are allowed a vast degree of creative license to move things around as we see fit. This means that we can correct tangents not just by shifting our butts from one side of the bench to another, but by simply moving them in your drawing. And such artistic liberties should not be limited to the correction of tangents. The fact is, no subject is perfect, and it's up to you to decide what to adjust to make a building taller, an ugly fountain disappear, to add texture here, and to simplify there. How much masters of landscape like Van Gogh or Rembrandt improved on what they were seeing, we'll never know. But there's a well-known anecdote about the French Romantic painter of landscape, Camille Corot. Someone approached him as he was painting a landscape, looked at his painting, and said, "It's wonderful, but where do you see the tree that you painted there?" And Corot replied, "Behind me." Granted, Corot's landscapes are more idealized and imbued with classical compositional order than Rembrandt or Van Gogh, but I'm certain that both of them did a great deal of tinkering with what they were seeing. So yes, you should definitely learn to draw landscape accurately, but recognize that accuracy and effective picture making are often at odds with one another, and in such battles, effective picture making should always win out. Which leads me to the third rule of composition, which actually is also one of the rules of choosing a subject. Emphasize diagonals on curves in your composition and avoid long, static, horizontal, and vertical lines. This rule is repeated because it's not only important to think about those diagonals when choosing a subject, but to also think about emphasizing those diagonals and even exaggerating them in your drawing. This is yet another way you're given creative license to improve upon your subject matter. So how does this work in practice? How do I take a subject and improve on it? Here is my reference again. Let's examine it and think about where it can be fixed. The easiest thing to do is to add clarity by eliminating some of the tangents. There aren't that many here, but perhaps the leaves of the tree are lining up with the window here. If you're working plein air, you might want to shift to the left or the right to find the best vantage point, but you'll find that by resolving one tangent, it often creates another. It's easier, therefore, to correct the tangents on your paper rather than shifting around to find just that perfect spot. Besides clearing up the tangents, I'm also going to simplify the composition where I feel the jumble of shapes might be confusing, which is why I'm going to get rid of the background buildings altogether. Lastly, the jumble of trees in the background could also be made more interesting by breaking them up slightly, creating stronger organic shapes, which will contrast nicely with all the blocky shapes of the building. I can also introduce additional movement to the composition by exaggerating some of the diagonals, perhaps in the back walls, here and here, and also in the cast shadows in the foreground. So what else can be adjusted? Well, as I mentioned, I'm always looking for something in the foreground, something in the middle ground, and something in the background. The foreground is a little bit empty here, so let's push the large tree on the left a little bit down so that it becomes more of a foreground element. Now that we've covered how to choose a subject and how to improve on it, let's start our drawing. I'm working in a sketchbook made by Talens Art Creations series, which contains a smooth multimedia paper that's great for pen and ink. I also like that the paper is light beige, which gives the drawing a softer feel. I'm sketching in things with a 2mm clutch pencil with an HB graphite lead. The first step is to loosely indicate the main elements of my composition without concern for accuracy. This is essentially a placeholder that allows me to put my horizon line in and then determine the vanishing points. As often happens, the vanishing points will be off my paper, in which case I keep a mental note of their location. If you'd like more information about linear perspective, I have a series of lessons on it on my channel, which will take you from the very basics all the way to how to draw a landscape using linear perspective from observation. Though I occasionally use a ruler when drawing architecture, I find it makes my drawings mechanical. Freehanding, while less accurate, gives your drawing a warmer feel. But even though I'm freehanding my lines, I'm still using many of the tricks of linear perspective. For example, by running diagonals from the corners, I'm able to determine the center of shapes where they cross. Now that my sketch is complete, I'm going to start inking. I'm using my trusty TWSBI Ecos for this purpose. Here I have an extra fine, a medium, and a broad. These are filled with carbon ink made by Platinum, a completely waterproof ink designed for fountain pens. Having 3 sizes of pens allows me to better control the depth because I can use the extra fine for the background, the medium for the middle ground, and the broad for the foreground. You could also use a flex pen or a food pen to control line width, but that's a much more difficult task. The process of inking begins with a background using my finest pen. I have a detailed tutorial on how to draw trees on my channel, so I'm not going to go too deeply here into my thought process. But to quickly summarize, I'm trying to keep the contours of the foliage open to emphasize the sense that we're looking at a three-dimensional mass of overlapping leaves. I'm also thinking about atmospheric perspective, making the lines of the foliage finer towards the tops and the edges, and a little bit larger where things are closer. I'm deviating from my reference a lot here by creating clear, hopefully interesting shapes. As a rule, you should try to clarify and give form anywhere you see a jumble, and the mass of trees in the background definitely needs clarification. I think my changes are an improvement over the jumbled mess that was there before. Okay, now I'm switching to my medium and starting to work on the building. Again, not using a ruler here and doing my best to make the lines straight. The good thing about these old structures is that they're not particularly straight anyway to begin with, so if you make a mistake with your lines, it's simply going to look like shoddy construction or earthquake damage. If I'm going to do a drawing of a modern office building, let's say, I wouldn't be able to get away with such sloppiness. Since the building is rough in texture, I'm using a slightly broken line in places. I'm also doing my best not to belabor the details here. I might add more later, but what I'm going for is an impressionistic effect where the details are suggested as opposed to rendered all the way through. Now I'm switching to my broad nib and working on the foreground, starting with the foliage of the tree. Again, thinking about keeping the edges of the leaves open to emphasize the complexity of the overlap, and making the leaf texture larger and larger and thicker as I work towards the center of the tree where it's going to be closest to the viewer. Now that my lines are put in, I'm going to shade this drawing starting with the background, again using my extra fine nib. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with hatching, parallel hatching, cross hatching, and cross contour hatching, I have a number of tutorials on the subject on my channel that cover those basics. The first step is to put down a layer of hatch to darken all the area of the trees in the background. I'm thinking like a watercolorist here, pretending like my hatch layers are a series of washes going from light to dark. I'm not paying attention to the forms at this stage, just thinking about value. The forms can be developed later. Once the overall dark value is put in, I start on the details. The key here is not to go too dark, not even close to as dark as I'm seeing in the reference. Keep in mind that photography has a tendency to simplify values, particularly in the darker and very lightest areas. This means that darker areas in the photo will look uniformly dark. The problem with this is that if you simply copy the values that you're seeing in the photo, it'll destroy the sense of atmospheric perspective, making things that should look far away appear as close as things in the foreground. When working from a photo, and really even when you're working from life, always think about what's best for the picture and make adjustments toward that end. This means when you're seeing a very dark value on things that are far away, don't render them that way. Okay, I've applied a few layers of light hatch to the trees, and I'm ready to move to the building. The trees might look incomplete, but remember that these are background elements. If I render too much and make them too busy, they might interfere with the other parts of the composition. Once I've covered everything with a layer of hatch, I might go back and add additional details, but I'm going to do my best not to make the background too dark or too busy. Though I'm rendering the middle ground, I'm going to stay with my extra fine nib. This is because I never want my hatching to be as thick as my line work. If that happens, if the hatching gets too thick, it'll start looking like texture rather than value. Just like the trees, I start putting down a single direction of hatch to get the overall value of the building. However, unlike in the trees, where the initial direction of the hatch isn't particularly important, the direction here has to be carefully considered. Here's an example. When hatching side-facing planes, your diagonals should be closer to vertical. Doing so creates a sense of compression, which will make those side-facing planes look like they're receding. To demonstrate this, here are two cubes. On cube A, I'm going to place a hatch of approximately 70 degrees. And on cube B, I'm going to place one that's about 30. Notice that the cube with a 70-degree hatch has a stronger sense of depth. Another thing to keep in mind is that if your hatching direction follows a side-facing plane, receding back in space, then you should shift the angle slightly so that it follows the shift in perspective. Notice how, when I'm doing the hatch going back, that the angle becomes flatter and flatter as it goes closer and closer to the top corner of the cube. And lastly, here is something you should avoid. While vertical hatching is fine everywhere, since it follows the direction of the plane, you should avoid horizontal hatching on side-facing planes as it breaks the illusion of receding space. Of course, if you do make this mistake, you can always just break up that hatch with another layer. Okay, finishing up the initial hatching layer on the building, notice that I'm not introducing the brick texture yet or adding details. That's because this is something I tend to do towards the end of my drawing once most of my hatch is already there. I found that if I put my texture in first, it's hard to gauge exactly how strong it needs to be, and I don't make it strong enough. By putting it in last, I can make sure it's nice and clear, and that I don't overdo it. Now it's time to render the tree in the foreground. I'm sticking with my extra fine nib and starting with my usual diagonal hatch to establish the overall form of the tree. I'm making the hatching slightly stronger here to make the foreground pop forward. The trick here is not to make the foreground too busy, however, because it'll pull attention away from my area of focus, which in this drawing is the building. This is why at this stage, once the initial hatching has been put down in the foreground, I start working a little bit everywhere in an effort to start balancing out the composition, emphasizing the area of focus and adding texture and detail. At this stage, I'm organizing the drawing, adding contrast, making sure that the separation of foreground, middle ground, and background are clear. I'm going to work a little bit more on this drawing off camera, but for now, let's call this demonstration done. And here is my finished drawing. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and if you did, hit subscribe and even consider donating to my channel. These tutorials at this point are a labor of love, but I would love to dedicate even more time to them, and your support will help me do that. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.